The wind screamed across Granite Peak like a living thing, hurling snow against Jake Morrison's cabin windows with the fury of a Category 5 hurricane. Weather reports called it the storm of the century. Temperatures plummeting to 40 below, winds exceeding 90 miles per hour, and no rescue possible for at least 2 weeks. Most people thought Jake was crazy for building his foundation the way his grandfather taught him, using an ancient technique that seemed to defy every modern construction principle. Even the building inspector had laughed, calling it mountain boy stupidity. But as Jake watched neighboring cabins buckle under the storm's assault while his remained rock solid, he knew the old man's wisdom ran deeper than anyone understood. What they didn't know was that Jake wasn't just any mountain boy. He was a former army engineer with 3 tours in Afghanistan, and he'd come to these mountains to disappear. The foundation wasn't just keeping him warm and dry, it was keeping him hidden from the cartel assassins who'd been hunting him for 6 months. But had his refuge just become his tomb? Jake pressed his face against the frosted glass, squinting through the howling white chaos. 300 yards down the slope, the Henderson cabin had collapsed an hour ago, its conventional foundation no match for the ground's relentless freeze-thaw cycle. The Yamamoto place had lost its entire south wall when the frost heave buckled the concrete slab. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Stone breathes. Boy, concrete suffocates. You want to survive up here, you learn to work with the mountain, not against it. The old man had insisted on hand-selecting each fieldstone, teaching Jake to read the subtle signs that revealed a rock's true character. No mortar between the stones, just careful placement that allowed the foundation to flex and settle with the mountain's movements. Beneath the stones, a complex drainage system of gravel and French drains that channeled moisture away from the cabin's footprint. Looks like a damn Indian ruin, the inspector had muttered, signing off only because Jake's engineering credentials and military service record had impressed him. Jake pulled back from the window, his breath forming ice crystals in the air despite the wood stove blazing in the corner. The cabin's interior temperature held steady at 68 degrees, the stone foundation acting as a massive thermal mass that stored and slowly released heat. While other cabins fought losing battles against the cold seeping up from frozen ground, Jake's shelter remained a warm island in the Arctic hell outside. He checked his watch, 3:47 a.m. The storm had been raging for 18 hours, with meteorologists predicting another 48 hours of intensity before any let-up. His supplies would last months if necessary. Military habit had him stockpiling everything from food to ammunition. But supplies meant nothing if the wrong people found him. 6 months ago, Jake had witnessed something in a Kandahar warehouse that he wasn't supposed to see. A handoff between his commanding officer and men with cartel tattoos. Crates of weapons disappearing from inventory, destined for Mexico rather than Afghan allies. When Jake tried to report it through proper channels, he discovered the corruption ran deeper than one rogue officer. The anonymous death threats started within a week. Then his apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Finally, his sister called from Denver, terrified, describing men who'd been asking questions about him in her neighborhood. That's when Jake Morrison officially died, at least on paper. He'd liquidated everything, bought the land under a carefully constructed false identity, and vanished into the Rockies. The foundation technique his grandfather taught him wasn't just about building a cabin, it was about creating an invisible fortress. A sharp crack from outside made him freeze, not the groan of settling wood or the snap of breaking branches. Something else, something that didn't belong in the storm's chaotic symphony. Jake moved away from the windows, muscle memory from 3 combat tours taking over. He pulled the Remington 700 from its hiding place beneath the floorboards, along with night vision goggles and tactical gear. The rifle had been zeroed for the exact distances around his property, each shooting position carefully planned and camouflaged. Through the night vision scope, he scanned the white maelstrom outside. The storm provided perfect cover for anyone crazy enough to attempt an approach. but it also limited visibility to mere yards, making any assault incredibly dangerous for the attackers. Another crack, closer this time, definitely not natural. Jake's breathing slowed, falling into the familiar rhythm of combat alertness. If they'd found him, and if they were insane enough to come after him in this storm, they'd chosen the wrong night. His hidden cabin wasn't just built on his grandfather's ancient foundation, it was designed as a sniper's nest, with carefully concealed firing positions and interlocking fields of fire. The storm might trap him here, but it would trap them too, and Jake knew these mountains better than anyone. He chambered around and settled into position at the reinforced window. Time to see who was desperate enough to hunt him through a blizzard. The wind hit like a freight train at 3 a.m, jerking Marcus from restless sleep. His cabin groaned and swayed, the logs settling with deep, resonant cracks that sounded like breaking bones. Outside, the storm had evolved into something beyond a blizzard. This was nature's fury unleashed, the kind of weather that rewrote topographical maps and left search and rescue teams shaking their heads. The cabin shuddered again, and Marcus instinctively placed his palm against the nearest wall. The logs were solid, unmoved, despite the building's dance with the wind. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Foundation's everything, boy. You can have the prettiest cabin in the county, but if she ain't rooted proper, first good storm will scatter her like matchsticks." Old Henrik had built this place in 1987, using a technique that had made the local contractors scratch their heads and mutter about city folk with more money than sense. Instead of the standard concrete pad or pier foundation, Henrik had insisted on what he called flexible anchoring, steel posts driven 20 feet into the mountain bedrock, connected to the cabin frame through a system of springs and shock absorbers salvaged from mining equipment. The whole structure could sway 6 inches in any direction, while remaining locked to its foundation. "Earthquake country up here," Henrik had explained when Marcus was 12, running his weathered hands along the unusual mounting hardware. "But it ain't the earthquakes that'll get you. It's the wind. Mountain wind's got personality, and she don't like things that won't bend." A tremendous gust slammed into the cabin's north wall, and Marcus watched his coffee mug slide 3 inches across the table before sliding back. The building was moving, actually moving, but it felt controlled, deliberate, like a boxer rolling with a punch instead of taking it square on the jaw. He pulled on his boots and heavy jacket, then stepped onto the covered porch to assess the storm. The world beyond his property line had vanished into a writhing wall of white. Snow fell horizontally, driven by winds that had to be pushing 80 miles per hour. The thermometer read -18 degrees, and that was before factoring in wind chill. This wasn't the storm he'd been tracking. This was something else entirely, some freak convergence of pressure systems that would have meteorologists writing papers for the next decade. If any of them survived to write papers. Marcus checked his radio, cycling through emergency frequencies. Nothing but static and the occasional burst of automated weather warnings. The repeater tower on Bear Mountain had probably lost power hours ago, leaving him cut off from the outside world until the storm passed. He was pulling firewood from the covered stack when movement caught his eye. At first, he dismissed it as wind-blown debris, but then he saw it again, a flash of yellow through the trees, too bright and too geometric to be natural. Someone was out there, moving through the storm with the deliberate progress of people who knew exactly where they were going. Marcus retreated into the cabin and grabbed his binoculars, positioning himself at the kitchen window. The yellow resolved into winter gear, high-end mountaineering suits that probably cost more than most people's cars. 3 figures were working their way up the slope toward his property, moving in single file and using the trees for windbreaks. They had snowshoes and ski poles, professional equipment that marked them as serious backcountry travelers. But no one traveled in weather like this unless they were running from something or towards something they wanted very badly. And Marcus's cabin was the only destination for miles in this direction. His satellite phone was in his emergency kit, but he'd need to get outside to establish a signal, and these visitors would reach his property line long before he could make contact with anyone who might help. Besides, help was at least 12 hours away in good weather. In this storm, he might as well be on the dark side of the moon. Marcus checked his rifle, a .308 Winchester that had belonged to his grandfather, and verified the magazine was loaded. He wasn't paranoid by nature, but 3 years of living alone in the mountains had taught him that coincidences were usually anything but coincidental. The figures disappeared behind a stand of lodgepole pines, but their trajectory was unmistakable. They'd reach his cabin within the hour, and when they did, Marcus suspected his problems were going to extend far beyond surviving the storm. He added another log to the fire and settled in to wait, his grandfather's voice whispering one more piece of wisdom. Sometimes the foundation that saves you ain't made of steel and stone, boy. Sometimes it's made of nerve and good judgment. Outside, the wind howled like something hungry, and 3 strangers climbed steadily through the white darkness toward his door. The wind hit like a freight train at 3 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake as the entire cabin groaned and shifted. Snow pelted the windows with machine gun intensity, and somewhere in the darkness, something metallic clanged against the outer walls. It weathered plenty of storms up here, but this felt different, angrier, more personal. Marcus rolled out of his sleeping bag and pulled on his boots, grabbing the heavy flashlight from beside his bed. The cabin's main room felt like the inside of a drum, every gust reverberating through the walls and floor. But as he moved toward the kitchen, something made him pause. The floor wasn't just vibrating from the wind, it was rock steady beneath his feet, as if the storm was happening around them rather than to them. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Foundation ain't just what holds you up, boy. It's what keeps you grounded when the world tries to shake you loose." The old man had spent 3 summers digging that foundation by hand, going down 8 feet into bedrock when any normal person would have stopped at 4. Marcus had been 12, more interested in fishing than construction, but Grandpa Joe had made him help anyway. "Feel that?" he'd said, running his weathered hands along the massive granite stones they'd hauled up from the creek. "That's what permanence feels like." Now, 20 years later, Marcus understood. While the wind tried to claw the cabin off the mountainside, those deep-set stones held firm, anchored to the mountain itself. The walls might sway slightly. Grandpa Joe had built in just enough flex to prevent snapping, but the foundation remained immovable. Marcus made his way to the window and wiped away the condensation. Outside was a white hell, snow flying horizontally in sheets so thick he couldn't see past the porch railing. The weather radio crackled to life with an automated warning about historic snowfall and life-threatening conditions, as if he needed confirmation of what was trying to kill him outside. He was brewing coffee when he heard the engine. At first, Marcus thought the wind was playing tricks on him. But there it was again, the distant rumble of a vehicle laboring up the mountain road. No one should be out in this. No one could be out in this. The access road was probably already impassable, and it would only get worse as the storm intensified. The engine noise grew louder, closer, then suddenly cut out. Marcus killed the cabin's propane lanterns and moved to the back window, the one that faced downhill toward the road. Through the swirling snow, he caught a glimpse of headlights going dark. Someone had made it to the clearing below his property, maybe a quarter-mile down the slope. His mind raced through possibilities. Lost hikers didn't drive snowmobiles at 3 a.m. in a blizzard. Park rangers would have called on the radio first. That left very few options, none of them good. Marcus thought about the encrypted drive hidden in his backpack, the one containing 3 years of financial records that could put some very dangerous people in federal prison. He'd been careful covering his tracks when he'd copied those files from his former employer's servers, but careful wasn't the same as invisible. Maybe not careful enough. The smart play was to grab his gear and disappear into the storm. He knew these mountains better than anyone, could survive in conditions that would kill most people. But looking out at the howling white chaos, even Marcus wasn't sure he could make it to the tree line alive. And Grandpa Joe's cabin had sheltered 3 generations of his family. Walking away felt like betrayal. Another sound cut through the wind, the mechanical whine of snowmobile engines starting up. Multiple engines. They were coming up the hill. Marcus moved fast, muscle memory taking over. He killed the coffee pot and any other signs of recent activity, then pulled his rifle from its case. The Winchester, 32-06, had belonged to his grandfather, and Marcus had put thousands of rounds through it over the years. In good conditions, he could hit a dinner plate at 300 yards, but visibility tonight was maybe 30 feet. The snowmobile engines grew louder. Marcus counted at least 2, maybe 3 machines climbing toward his ridge. Whoever these people were, they'd come prepared for the conditions and prepared to follow him into wilderness that should have been impossible to navigate. As the first headlight beam cut through the snow near his property line, Marcus made his decision. The cabin's foundation had been built to withstand anything the mountain could throw at it. Time to find out if the same was true for the man inside. He checked the rifle's action one more time and settled into position by the front window, where the thick log walls would provide the best cover. Outside, the storm raged with biblical fury, but inside, surrounded by his grandfather's unshakable craftsmanship, Marcus felt oddly calm. Let them come. The mountain would show them no mercy, and neither would he. The wind had been howling for 6 hours straight when Jake first heard the sound that didn't belong. He'd been dozing fitfully in his sleeping bag, the cabin's walls groaning and creaking around him like a ship in heavy seas. But this was different, a metallic clang, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the storm's fury. Jake's eyes snapped open, every nerve suddenly alert. The sound came again, closer this time. Metal against metal, followed by what might have been a muffled curse. Someone was out there in the blizzard. He rolled silently from his sleeping bag, bare feet finding the cold planks of the floor. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped considerably since he'd let the fire burn low, but he barely noticed. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. First rule of survival: always know what's coming before it knows you're there. Creeping to the window, Jake brushed away the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass. The world beyond was a wall of white snow driven horizontal by winds that had to be pushing 60 miles per hour. Visibility was maybe 10 feet at best, yet somewhere in that maelstrom someone was moving. Another sound reached him, the distinctive scrape of a snowshoe against a tree. Jake's jaw tightened. No casual hiker would be caught dead in conditions like this. Whoever was out there had come prepared, and they'd come with purpose. He moved away from the window, muscle memory guiding him through the cabin's layout in the darkness. His hands found his rifle where he'd left it propped against the wall, then his boots and heavy jacket. The emergency radio crackled with static from its perch on the small table, but he'd given up hope of reaching anyone hours ago. The storm was jamming every frequency. The front door shuddered under a particularly vicious gust, and Jake realized with growing dread that the sound might mask an approach. He needed to know how many were out there and what they wanted. More importantly, he needed to know if they'd found his cabin by accident or design. Slipping into his boots without lacing them, Jake eased toward the back of the cabin where his grandfather had installed a small observation port. Barely more than a crack between 2 logs, invisible from the outside, but offering a narrow view of the surrounding area. It had seemed like paranoid overkill when he was 12. Now he blessed the old man's suspicious nature. The port gave him a view of the western approach to the cabin, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A figure in white winter camouflage was moving methodically through the trees, clearly following some kind of planned route. Military surplus gear, Jake noted. Expensive stuff. This wasn't some lost hiker or stranded hunter. The figure paused, raising what looked like a radio to his face. Jake couldn't hear the transmission over the wind, but he saw the man gesture toward the cabin before continuing his advance. That answered the question of whether they'd found him by accident. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. The men from the gas station had seemed like small-time trouble, but this level of preparation suggested something much more serious. Had he stumbled into something bigger when he'd witnessed that exchange? Or was there something else, something he wasn't seeing? A new sound cut through his thoughts, the soft thunk of snowshoes on the cabin's front porch. Jake's blood turned to ice. While he'd been watching the western approach, someone had circled around to the front. They were coordinating their movements, probably communicating through radio headsets he couldn't see. He moved back toward the center of the cabin, rifle in hand, trying to calculate angles and distances. The cabin was solid. His grandfather had built it to last, but it wasn't a fortress. The windows were large enough for a man to climb through, and there were only so many directions he could watch at once. A gentle testing pressure on the front door made his decision for him. Jake slipped toward the back wall where his grandfather had installed what he'd called his insurance policy, a section of wall that could be removed from the inside, creating an emergency exit. The old man had been paranoid about fire, but it would serve just as well for a different kind of emergency. As Jake's fingers found the hidden catches that would release the panel, he heard the soft scritch of metal tools working on the front door's lock. Professional work, almost silent beneath the storm's cover. These weren't random criminals, they were trained, equipped, and determined. The panel swung inward on silent hinges, revealing the howling chaos of the blizzard beyond. Jake hesitated for just a moment, weighing his chances in the storm against the certainty of being trapped inside. Then he heard the front door's lock give way with a barely audible click. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped out into the teeth of the blizzard, his grandfather's voice following him into the white void. Sometimes the only way to survive is to embrace the very thing that's trying to kill you. The wind's howling had become a constant companion, but something else cut through it now, the distant rumble of an engine fighting its way up the mountain. Jake's blood turned to ice as he pressed his face against the frosted window, squinting through the swirling white chaos outside. There, a pair of headlights, maybe half a mile down the trail, crawling upward through drifts that should have been impassable. The vehicle lurched and bucked, but it kept coming. These weren't lost tourists or weekend hikers caught off guard by the storm. This was determination wrapped in steel and glass. Jake's mind raced back to the convenience store in Durango 3 days ago, where he'd stopped for supplies before heading to the cabin. He'd kept his head down, paid cash, but that man in the corner, the one with the spider tattoo creeping up his neck, had been watching. Jake had felt those eyes tracking him as he loaded his truck, and now he understood why his instincts had been screaming at him to run. The headlights disappeared behind a stand of snow-laden pines, but the engine noise persisted. Jake estimated 20 minutes, maybe 30 if the drifts slowed them down enough. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When you can't run, you dig in. When you can't hide, you make them wish they'd never found you. He grabbed the emergency radio from the kitchen shelf and tried the emergency frequency again. Static. The storm was eating every signal, turning the mountain into an island cut off from the world below. His cell phone showed the same story, no bars, no hope of calling for help. The cabin groaned as another gust hammered the walls, but the structure held firm. Grandpa's foundation technique was keeping them anchored, but Jake needed more than a strong foundation now. He needed a fortress. Moving quickly, he dragged the heavy oak table from the kitchen to barricade the front door. The wood scraped against the floor, a sound that seemed too loud despite the storm's fury. Next came the bookshelf, its weight making his shoulders burn as he wrestled it into position. Every piece of furniture became part of his defensive line. The engine noise grew louder. Jake checked his supplies. 3 boxes of ammunition for the rifle, 2 for the pistol. Enough food for a week if he rationed carefully. Water wouldn't be a problem, he could melt snow indefinitely. But ammunition was finite, and he had no idea how many men were coming up that mountain or how well armed they were. He thought about Elena's warning back in Denver. These people don't forget, Jake. They don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't give up. He should have listened, should have kept running instead of thinking one winter in his grandfather's cabin would be enough to wait out the heat. The headlights reappeared much closer now, maybe 10 minutes out. Jake killed all the lights in the cabin, plunging himself into darkness. The storm provided enough ambient light through the windows to navigate, but anyone approaching would see only a dark, seemingly abandoned structure. He pulled on his grandfather's old military jacket, the one with the faded patches from Vietnam, and checked his weapons one final time. The foundation beneath his feet felt solid, unmoving despite the wind that should have been shaking the entire structure. Grandpa had built this place to last, using techniques he'd learned from an old Norwegian homesteader who'd survived 40 Colorado winters. The secret wasn't just in the concrete and rebar buried deep below the frost line. It was in the way the whole cabin worked as a single unit, flexible enough to bend but too strong to break. Jake positioned himself at the back window, rifle ready, watching the tree line where the trail emerged. The engine noise was almost on top of him now, gears grinding as the vehicle fought through the deepest drifts. Then he saw it. A black SUV with chains on all 4 tires, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. The vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, engine running, headlights cutting through the snow like accusatory fingers. Jake counted the shadows moving inside, at least 3 figures, maybe 4. They sat there for long minutes, probably studying the cabin, planning their approach. The passenger door opened first. A man stepped out, rifle in hand, moving with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to violence. He gestured to the others, and 2 more figures emerged from the vehicle. The driver stayed behind the wheel, ready for a quick escape or a rapid pursuit. Jake's breathing slowed to match his heartbeat. Grandpa had taught him to shoot, but more importantly, he'd taught him to think. Every battle is won in the mind before the first shot is fired, the old man used to say. Know your ground, know your enemy, and know yourself. The cabin was his ground. The storm was his ally. And these men had just made the mistake of following him into both. The wind had grown teeth during the night, gnawing at the cabin's walls with a ferocity that made sleep impossible. Jake pressed his ear to the thick logs, listening to the storm's assault, but underneath the howling he caught something else. A rhythm that didn't belong to nature's chaos. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, circling the cabin. He rolled away from the wall and crawled to his pack, fingers finding the Glock's familiar grip. The cabin's single window had been boarded over before the storm hit, but thin gaps between the planks offered narrow sight lines. Jake positioned himself at the largest gap and peered into the white maelstrom. A shadow moved past, hunched against the driving snow. Then another, 20 feet to the left. His pulse hammered as he counted at least 3 distinct shapes making their way around the structure. They moved with military precision despite the brutal conditions, and Jake realized with cold certainty that these weren't lost hikers seeking shelter. Should have kept running, he whispered to himself, thinking of the choice he'd made to hunker down rather than push deeper into the wilderness. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the best place to hide is right where you are, boy. Let the storm be your ally. One of the figures approached the door, and Jake caught a glimpse of tactical gear beneath a white camouflage parka. Definitely military or ex-military. The man examined the entrance, running gloved hands along the frame, testing the heavy timber construction. He said something to his companions, but his words were swallowed by the wind. Jake's mind raced through his options. The cabin had only one entrance, which was both a blessing and a curse. They couldn't surprise him from multiple directions, but he was also trapped with no escape route. The root cellar his grandfather had carved beneath the floorboards might offer temporary concealment, but it would become a tomb if they decided to torch the place. The lead figure stepped back from the door and made a hand signal. His companions spread out, taking positions that suggested they planned to breach. Jake noticed they weren't wearing snowshoes or skis. Their boots sank deep with each step, slowing their movement. The storm that trapped him was hampering them too. A metallic scraping sound came from the door as someone worked at the heavy iron latch. Jake had secured it from the inside with a thick wooden bar, but determined men with the right tools could eventually break through. He needed to even the odds before that happened. Moving to the stone fireplace, Jake grabbed a handful of the special kindling his grandfather had taught him to prepare, thin strips of pine soaked in rendered fat. He lit 3 pieces from the dying embers and crept to different corners of the room, placing them strategically, not to burn the cabin down, but to create light and shadow that would work in his favor. The door shuddered as something heavy struck it. Once, twice, then a pause. Jake pressed himself against the wall beside the entrance, weapon raised. His breathing slowed, falling into the rhythm his grandfather had drilled into him during countless hunting trips. And breathe in the calm, breathe out the fear. Foundations holding, he murmured, feeling the solid stonework beneath his feet. The building that had seemed like a shelter was now his fortress, and every technique his grandfather had used in its construction was designed for exactly this kind of siege. The double-thick walls, the reinforced door frame, the strategic placement of support beams, all of it served dual purposes that Jake was only now beginning to understand. The door splintered along one edge, but the frame held. Cursed voices carried through the gap, frustrated and urgent. Jake realized they were working against time too. The storm was getting worse, and hypothermia would claim them long before they could wait him out. Another impact, and this time the wooden bar cracked. Jake steadied his aim at the center of the door, knowing he'd get one good shot before the situation devolved into chaos. His finger found the trigger's sweet spot, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack. The wind outside shifted direction, and in the momentary lull, Jake heard something that made his blood freeze: radio chatter. They weren't just hunting him, they were coordinating with someone else. This wasn't a simple tracking operation. It was something bigger, more organized. The wooden bar split completely, and the door burst inward. Jake fired twice at the first figure through the opening, watching the man stumble backward into his companions. Shouts erupted outside, followed by the distinctive crack of return fire. Bullets punched through the thick logs, but lost most of their velocity, embedding harmlessly in the back wall. Jake dropped to a crouch and scrambled toward the fireplace, using the dancing shadows to mask his movement. The burning kindling cast wild patterns across the walls, making it difficult for the attackers to acquire clear targets through the doorway. This was exactly what his grandfather had prepared him for, though neither of them could have imagined it would happen quite like this. The wind had teeth now, gnawing at the cabin's walls with a hunger that made the entire structure groan. Jake pressed his back against the kitchen counter, watching the windows flex inward with each savage gust. The glass held, but barely. Outside, the world had vanished into a swirling white void that seemed to devour sound and light with equal malice. 3 hours had passed since he'd spotted movement through the trees. 3 hours of waiting, listening, and preparing for whatever came next. The storm had intensified beyond anything the weather service had predicted, transforming from a severe blizzard into something that belonged in the pages of frontier horror stories. Temperature readings on his digital thermometer had dropped to -32 and were still falling. But it wasn't the cold that made his hands shake as he checked his rifle for the 4th time. It was the certainty that he wasn't alone on this mountain anymore. The cabin's foundation system had proven itself admirably. While the structure above swayed and creaked under the wind's assault, the base remained solid as bedrock. Grandpa's revolutionary approach, a network of deep-set pylons connected by flexible joints that could absorb and distribute stress, was keeping them anchored when a traditional foundation would have already begun to crack. The old man had designed it to move with the mountain rather than fight it, and tonight that philosophy was being tested to its absolute limits. Jake moved to the front window, careful to stay back from the glass. The world beyond was a chaos of horizontal snow and debris. Pine boughs the size of baseball bats tumbled past like tumbleweeds. Somewhere in that maelstrom, men with bad intentions were struggling to reach him. The thought should have been comforting. Surely no one could navigate in these conditions, but Jake had learned not to underestimate desperate people. A sharp crack from the roof sent his heart racing. He grabbed the flashlight and climbed the ladder to the loft, playing the beam across the wooden beams above. A thin line of snow was sifting through a gap where 2 boards had separated slightly. Not catastrophic, but something to monitor. He stuffed a towel into the crack and made a mental note to check it again in an hour. The cabin's heating system was holding steady, the propane-powered unit cycling on and off with mechanical precision. He'd built redundancy into every system, following another of his grandfather's principles: hope for the best, plan for the worst, and always have a backup for your backup. The wood stove provided secondary heat, while emergency chemical heat packs waited in the supply closet as a final resort. As he descended from the loft, A new sound cut through the wind's roar, a rhythmic thumping, barely audible but distinctly different from the random percussion of storm debris. Jake froze on the ladder, straining to isolate the noise. There, again. 3 quick impacts followed by silence, then repeated. Someone was signaling. He dropped to the floor and moved to the back window, the one that faced the steepest part of the slope. Logic said no one could approach from that direction, especially in these conditions. But logic also said no one should have been able to track him this far in the first place. The signaling stopped. Jake waited, rifle ready, watching the swirling snow for any sign of movement. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Just as he began to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing, a darker shape separated itself from the white chaos, a figure hunched against the wind, moving with painful slowness toward the cabin's rear wall. Jake's finger found the rifle's safety, clicking it off with practiced silence. The figure stopped 20 yards from the building, and even through the storm, Jake could see it wasn't one of the men who'd been tracking him. This person was smaller, moving differently. Hurt, maybe, or exhausted beyond measure. A lost hiker. Someone who'd been caught out when the storm hit and was now desperately seeking shelter. Every humanitarian instinct screamed at him to open the door, to pull this person inside where it was warm and safe. But every survival instinct he possessed whispered a different warning. This could be a trap. The figure collapsed in the snow, then struggled back to its feet. The movement looked genuine, the kind of exhausted stumbling that couldn't be easily faked. Jake watched through the scope of his rifle as the person took another few steps forward, then fell again. This time they stayed down longer, and when they rose, their movements were even more labored. Decision time. He could maintain his defensive position and let nature take its course, preserving his own safety at the cost of another person's life. Or he could take the risk, open his door to a stranger in a storm, and possibly compromise everything his grandfather had built for him. The wind screamed louder, and in its voice Jake heard echoes of every hard choice that had ever been made in these mountains. Some decisions couldn't be unmade, and some risks were worth taking even when the stakes were life and death. He moved toward the door. The wind had changed. Jake noticed it first as a subtle shift in the cabin's creaking, then as a more pronounced howling that seemed to come from a different direction entirely. He pressed his face to the frost-covered window, trying to peer through the relentless white curtain outside. The storm was intensifying, if that was even possible. Snow drove horizontally now, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. Even the massive pines surrounding his cabin had become ghostly silhouettes, barely visible through the chaos. A metallic scraping sound cut through the wind's roar. Jake froze, every muscle tensing. That wasn't the storm. That was deliberate, purposeful, the sound of metal against stone. Someone was out there moving around his cabin despite the deadly conditions. He grabbed his rifle and moved away from the window, keeping low. The sound came again, closer now, from the cabin's north side where the foundation met the rocky outcrop. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Stone speaks to stone, boy. That's why we built her into the mountain itself." The old man's unconventional foundation technique had seemed like overkill when Jake was younger. Instead of simply pouring concrete, his grandfather had carved directly into the granite shelf, creating interlocking channels that wedged the cabin's support beams into the living rock. The result was a structure that didn't just sit on the mountain, it became part of it. Another scrape, followed by what sounded like frustrated cursing barely audible above the wind. Someone was testing the foundation, looking for weaknesses, trying to find a way in that didn't involve the reinforced door or the small high-set windows. Jake's mind raced. In weather like this, any sane person would be seeking shelter, not conducting reconnaissance, which meant these weren't casual hikers caught in the storm. These were the men from Denver, the ones who'd made it clear his testimony in the trafficking case made him a liability they couldn't afford. The scraping moved along the cabin's perimeter. Jake tracked the sound, staying low and away from the windows. His grandfather's paranoid construction methods were paying off in ways the old man probably never imagined. The foundation was essentially a puzzle of interlocking stone and steel, impossible to compromise without proper tools and considerable time, neither of which the men outside possessed. A new sound emerged from the storm, voices shouting to be heard over the wind. Jake caught fragments, coordinates, positions, something about the back approach being impossible. They were coordinating, which meant at least two of them, probably more. He moved to his emergency supplies, pulling out the battery-powered radio he'd brought for weather updates. The channels were mostly static now, the storm wreaking havoc with local transmissions, but he managed to catch a brief weather bulletin: unprecedented wind speeds approaching 150 miles per hour. Emergency services suspended, all residents advised to shelter in place. 150 miles per hour. That was approaching Category 4 hurricane strength, but with the added danger of sub-zero temperatures and driving snow. Anyone caught outside in this would have minutes, not hours, before hypothermia set in. A heavy thump against the cabin's east wall made him jump. Something, or someone, had been thrown against the structure by the wind. The sound was followed by a prolonged scraping, as if whoever it was had tried to grab hold and was being dragged along the wall by the storm's fury. Jake felt a grim satisfaction. The mountain was fighting his battles for him now. His pursuers might have weapons and numbers, but they were city men, unaccustomed to the Rockies' brutal indifference to human plans. The storm didn't care about their mission or their timeline. It only cared about consuming everything in its path. The wind's pitch rose to a shriek that made the cabin's walls vibrate. Through the chaos, Jake heard a new sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable crack of a tree falling. The crash that followed shook the ground beneath the cabin's foundation, and for a moment the building itself seemed to sway. Then silence fell like a curtain, broken only by the storm's relentless howling. Jake waited, rifle ready, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. The fallen tree might have taken out one of his pursuers, or it might have simply created new cover for them to use. Either way, it had changed the tactical situation around his cabin. Minutes passed. The scraping sounds didn't resume. Either the men had retreated to wait out the worst of the storm, or the mountain had claimed them entirely. Jake wasn't ready to bet his life on either scenario. He settled in beside the window with the best view of the approaches, rifle across his knees. His grandfather's fortress would hold. He was certain of that now. The real question was whether he could outlast both the storm and the men who'd followed him into this frozen hell. Outside, the blizzard raged on, indifferent to human schemes and survival alike. The wind had shifted during the night, and Jake knew immediately that something was wrong. The sound was different, less howling, more focused, like a predator circling its prey. He'd been awake since 3, listening to the storm's symphony and mentally cataloguing every creak and groan of the cabin's joints. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "A building talks to you, boy. Learn its language." By dawn, the snow had piled nearly 6 feet against the north wall. Jake watched through the single window as the drifts climbed steadily upward, threatening to bury the structure entirely. The cabin shuddered with each gust, but the foundation held firm. He could feel it beneath his feet, solid, unmoving, anchored deep into the mountain's bedrock. The radio crackled to life with a weather update that made his stomach drop. The storm was intensifying beyond all predictions. Wind speeds had reached 90 miles per hour at the peaks, and the National Weather Service was calling it a once-in-a-century event. All rescue operations had been suspended indefinitely. Jake was truly alone now, except for the men who'd followed him up here. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He rationed his breakfast carefully, half a can of beans and a strip of jerky. His food supplies would last maybe 4 more days if he was disciplined. The wood pile was more encouraging. He'd been conservative with the fire, keeping it just hot enough to prevent hypothermia while avoiding the telltale smoke that might give away his exact position. Around noon, he heard something that made him freeze mid-bite. Engines. Multiple engines, somewhere down the mountain, fighting their way through the snow. The sound came in waves, carried on the wind, growing closer then fading as the vehicles navigated the treacherous terrain. Jake moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the frost. Nothing visible yet, but the sound was unmistakable. Snowmobiles, at least 3 of them, maybe 4. His pursuers had found motorized transport somewhere and were making another push up the mountain despite the storm. He grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber, then moved to his small cache of additional ammunition. 23 rounds total, not nearly enough for a prolonged firefight, but maybe enough to discourage them if they found his location. The engines grew louder, and Jake caught his first glimpse of movement through the swirling snow, dark shapes weaving between the trees, following what used to be the hiking trail. They were still a quarter-mile down the slope, but climbing steadily. The lead rider raised his hand, and the group stopped, engines idling. Jake held his breath as one of the men dismounted and examined something in the snow. Tracks, probably. Jake had made several trips to the nearby stream for water over the past 2 days, and despite his efforts to obscure his path, an experienced tracker would spot the signs. The man gestured toward Jake's general area, and the group remounted. They spread out into a search pattern, engines revving as they began a systematic sweep of the mountainside. Jake's cabin was well hidden among the pines, but it wouldn't stay hidden long with 4 searchers covering the terrain methodically. He had maybe 10 minutes before they reached his position. Jake quickly gathered his essential gear, water, ammunition, first aid kit, and what food he could carry. His original plan had been to outlast them in the cabin, but that was no longer an option. He'd have to lead them away from his shelter and hope the storm would force them to retreat again. But first, he needed to give them something to find. Working quickly, Jake built up the fire until it was crackling enthusiastically, sending a plume of smoke up the chimney. He scattered a few belongings around the cabin, a spare jacket, some empty food cans, his backup sleeping bag. To a cursory inspection, it would look like someone was sheltering here. The engines were getting closer. Through the window, Jake could see the lead snowmobile weaving between trees just 100 yards down the slope. The rider wore military-style winter gear and carried what looked like an assault rifle across his back. Jake slipped out the cabin's back door and immediately sank knee-deep into fresh snow. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to move carefully and quietly. He needed to circle around behind his pursuers to see what they were planning without being detected. He made it perhaps 50 yards when the first engine cut off, then the second. The men had found something, his tracks most likely, leading to the cabin. Jake crouched behind a fallen log and watched as 4 figures approached his shelter. They moved with military precision, weapons ready, communicating with hand signals. The storm was his only advantage now. In this whiteout, visibility was maybe 30 feet in any direction. If he was careful, he could shadow them without being seen. But one mistake, one careless step, and he'd be exposed on the mountainside with nowhere to run. The lead man reached Jake's door and gestured for the others to surround the cabin. Jake gripped his rifle tighter and prepared to move. The silence after the gunshot stretched like a held breath. Jake pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the cave, his heart hammering so hard he was certain it would give away his position. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but underneath that natural fury, he could hear voices. Urgent, frustrated whispers carried on the gusts. Where the hell did he go? The voice belonged to Rodriguez, sharp with anger. Had to be around here somewhere. Blood trail leads right to those rocks. That was Morrison, closer than Jake liked. Much closer. Jake's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, warm blood seeping through his torn jacket. The wound wasn't deep, but in these conditions, even a scratch could become life-threatening. He needed to move, but the cave opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders. One wrong sound, and they'd have him cornered like a rat in a pipe. The beam of a flashlight swept across the cave mouth, and Jake held his breath. The light lingered, probing the shadows just feet from where he crouched. He could see Morrison's boots through a gap in the rocks, black military-style combat boots that looked out of place in the wilderness. "Check every crevice," Morrison ordered. "He's bleeding. Can't have gone far." Jake closed his eyes and tried to think like his grandfather. What would the old man do? Samuel Chen had survived worse than this. Korean War winters, building sites in impossible conditions, corporate sharks who'd tried to destroy his business. He'd always said that the foundation was everything. Get that right, and you could weather any storm. The foundation. Jake's mind raced back to the cabin, to his grandfather's unusual construction technique. The old man hadn't just built a structure, he'd created something that worked with the mountain instead of fighting it. Maybe that was the key. Stop fighting, start working with what he had. The cave was narrow, but it ran deeper than he'd first realized. As his eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness, he could feel a slight air current coming from somewhere behind him. Another opening, maybe, or at least a way deeper into the mountain. Jake began to crawl backward, moving inch by careful inch. The rock scraped against his injured shoulder, sending fresh waves of pain through his arm, but he bit down on any sound. Behind him, he could hear Morrison and Rodriguez spreading out, their search becoming more systematic. "Found more blood here," Rodriguez called out. "Fresh drops. He's close. Check that crack in the rocks." The flashlight beam swept past the cave opening again, and this time Jake saw Morrison's face in the reflected light. The man's expression was cold, professional. This wasn't personal for him. Jake was just another problem to be solved, another loose end to be tied up. As Jake crawled deeper into the cave, his hand touched something unexpected. Wood. Old, weathered wood that had no business being this far into a mountain cave. He ran his fingers along its surface, trying to understand what he'd found. It felt like a beam, maybe 8 inches square, running perpendicular to his path. Then he remembered something his grandfather had told him about the early days of construction in the Rockies. Miners would sometimes shore up natural caves and use them as emergency shelters or storage. If this was one of those old mining operations, there might be another way out. "I'm going to smoke him out," Morrison's voice echoed from outside. "If he's in there, this'll flush him." The acrid smell of burning plastic reached Jake's nose. They were starting a fire at the cave mouth, probably using something from their gear. In minutes, this narrow space would fill with smoke. He had to move now. Jake followed the wooden beam, crawling as quickly as he dared in the absolute darkness. The passage seemed to widen slightly, and the air current grew stronger, definitely another opening somewhere ahead. Behind him, smoke began to curl into the cave, carried by the wind. His eyes started to water, and he fought the urge to cough. The wooden supports were more frequent now, creating a rough framework along the cave walls. Someone had definitely worked this space, probably decades ago. His hand suddenly met empty air. Jake froze, reaching out carefully to map the space in front of him. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and the air current was coming from his right. He could even detect a hint of snow in the air, an opening to the outside. Moving by, feel alone, Jake worked his way toward the source of the fresh air. The wooden supports gave way to natural rock formations, and then, impossibly, he saw the faintest glimmer of grey light ahead. Another cave mouth, partially hidden by an overhang of rock and probably invisible from below. Jake squeezed toward it, his shoulders screaming in protest. Behind him, the smoke was getting thicker, and he could hear Morrison cursing as he realized his prey had escaped the trap. Jake reached the opening and looked out at the storm-lashed mountainside. He was at least 50 feet above his pursuers, with a clear view of their position. More importantly, he had options again. The foundation holds, he thought, remembering his grandfather's words, "Build it right, and everything else follows." The wind had shifted again, and Jake could feel the change in the cabin's rhythm. What had been a steady, almost reassuring groan was now punctuated by sharp cracks that made his teeth clench. He pressed his ear to the floor, listening to the foundation's song beneath him. The deep, resonant hum was still there, but fainter now, like a voice growing hoarse. Through the storm's howling, another sound cut through, the unmistakable whine of a snowmobile engine fighting through deep powder. Jake's blood turned to ice. They'd found him. He scrambled to the window, wiping away frost with his sleeve. The world outside was a churning white void, but there, a faint yellow glow bobbing through the trees. Then another. 2 machines, maybe 300 yards out and closing. Jake's mind raced. The storm should have covered his tracks completely, made it impossible to follow his route up the mountain. Unless they weren't following tracks at all, unless they knew exactly where they were going. The radio. He lunged for it, fingers fumbling with the controls. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of voices. Visual on the structure. Approach from the east. Remember, we need him alive. Jake's stomach dropped. Professional, organized. And they had radio communication despite the storm, which meant serious equipment. These weren't the desperate men who'd chased him from the valley. Someone had sent a team. The snowmobile engines grew louder, then suddenly cut out. In the relative quiet that followed, Jake could hear them shouting to each other over the wind, though their words were lost in the storm's fury. He estimated they'd stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, smart tactical distance. Close enough to assault, far enough to avoid immediate detection of their numbers and positions. Jake checked his rifle, though he knew 12 rounds wouldn't last long against a coordinated team. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes the best fight is the one you don't have to take, Jake. Smart man knows when to bend and when to break." The cabin shuddered as a massive gust hit it, and this time Jake heard something new, a grinding sound from deep below. One of the gyroscopic stabilizers was struggling. He could feel it in the slight list the cabin had developed, like a ship taking on water. A voice boomed through a megaphone, barely audible above the storm. "Jake Morrison, we know you're in there. Come out and we can talk." Jake almost laughed. Talk, right. He'd seen what their talking looked like back at the ranger station. The grinding sound below intensified, and Jake made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand his grandfather's engineering. He grabbed the emergency manual for the foundation system, a leather-bound notebook filled with Elias's cramped handwriting, and flipped to a section he'd hoped never to use. "Emergency protocols," the header read. "When conventional stability fails, embrace controlled instability." The instructions were typically cryptic, but Jake understood. His grandfather had built more than just a stable foundation. He'd built an adaptive one. The gyroscopic system could be manually overridden, the counterweights redistributed. Instead of fighting the storm's chaos, the cabin could dance with it. Another blast from the megaphone. "You've got 60 seconds, Morrison, then we come in." Jake's fingers flew across the manual override controls, hidden behind a panel near the floor. The system was entirely mechanical, no electronics to fail, no power source to cut. Pure engineering genius powered by the storm itself. As he adjusted the settings, he felt the cabin's movement change. Instead of the rigid resistance he'd maintained all night, the structure began to sway more freely, finding a strange harmony with the wind. The first gunshot shattered the front window, filling the cabin with snow and razor shards of glass. Jake dropped flat, crawling toward the back of the cabin as more shots punched through the walls. They weren't trying to kill him. The shots were too high, meant to suppress and terrify. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They didn't understand what they were shooting at. With each impact, the cabin's new movement pattern absorbed and redistributed the kinetic energy. Bullets that should have splintered through the walls were instead deflected by the structure's constant motion. The foundation system turned the entire building into a massive shock absorber. Jake heard confused shouting outside. Their tactical approach assumed a static target. Instead, they were trying to assault a building that danced like a leaf in the wind, never quite where it had been a moment before. A new sound joined the storm's symphony, the sharp crack of overstressed trees. The wind was picking up again, and Jake realized the true genius of his grandfather's emergency protocol. The cabin wasn't just surviving the storm now, it was using the storm as a weapon. Through the broken window, he saw a massive pine topple, its fall guided by the wind's fury directly toward the attacker's position. Shouts of alarm pierced the night as men scrambled for cover. The real battle was just beginning. The wind had shifted again, no longer the constant howl that had become background noise, but something more sinister, irregular gusts that made the cabin creak in unexpected rhythms. Jake pressed his ear against the reinforced door, straining to hear beyond the storm's chaos. 3 hours had passed since he'd spotted movement through the window, and the silence from his pursuers was more unnerving than any direct assault would have been. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Patience is a predator's greatest weapon, but it's also their weakness. While they're thinking, you should be moving. Jake had spent those 3 hours doing exactly that. The cabin's interior now resembled a fortress prepared for siege. He'd moved every piece of furniture that wasn't bolted down to create barriers and shooting positions. The cast-iron stove, still radiating heat, sat in the center like an anchor point. More importantly, he'd activated the cabin's hidden defenses, features his grandfather had built into the structure that went far beyond the revolutionary foundation. The first was a series of mirrored periscopes hidden within the wall supports, allowing him to observe all 4 sides of the cabin without exposing himself to windows. Through these, he'd tracked his hunters as they established positions in the tree line. 3 men, just as he'd suspected. They'd tried to approach twice, but the combination of deep snow and the cabin's elevated position on the reinforced platform made any stealth advance nearly impossible. The second defense was more subtle. Hidden beneath the floorboards ran a network of cables connected to a series of motion-triggered alarms positioned 50 feet out in each direction. His grandfather had disguised them as natural deadfall, but each was carefully calibrated to detect human movement while ignoring the weight of snow or small animals. The gentle chimes that sounded when the system activated had allowed Jake to track every repositioning attempt. Now, peering through the eastern periscope, he watched one of the figures break from cover. The man moved in short bursts, using the larger pine trees for concealment. Professional, but not perfect. Jake could see the tactical gear beneath the winter clothing, the way the man held his rifle, the deliberate clearing of angles as he advanced. Military training, probably recent enough that the movements hadn't yet been adapted for civilian scenarios. Jake shifted to the southern periscope. The second man was circling wide, trying to approach from the cabin's blind spot, except his grandfather hadn't left any blind spots. This one moved differently, more cautious, older maybe. The leader, if Jake had to guess. The kind who let others test the defenses while he observed and adapted. The third man remained in overwatch position to the north, rifle trained on the cabin's front entrance. Smart tactical deployment, but they were thinking in terms of normal structures. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. Jake's hand found the first of his grandfather's surprise mechanisms, a lever hidden behind the stove that controlled the cabin's final secret. The old man had called it the equalizer, though he'd never explained exactly what it did. Jake had discovered it only this morning, while reinforcing his positions, along with a note in his grandfather. Handwriting, when cornered, changed the game entirely. Through the eastern periscope, he watched the first attacker reach the cabin's support platform. The man paused, clearly surprised by the unusual elevation and the massive reinforced posts. He circled one of the foundation pillars, trying to understand the construction. That hesitation was exactly what Jake had been waiting for. The storm provided perfect cover as Jake moved to the cabin's rear wall and opened a concealed panel. Inside was a hand crank mechanism connected to a series of cables that ran down into the foundation itself. His grandfather's final lesson in engineering, it seemed. Jake began to turn the crank, feeling significant resistance as the mechanism engaged. Outside, the change was subtle at first. The cabin's platform began to rotate so slowly that the movement was barely perceptible. But his grandfather had designed the system to use the storm winds as additional power, and the irregular gusts that had been battering the structure now became part of the defense. The entire cabin was turning on its axis, maintaining the high ground advantage while completely disrupting his attacker's carefully planned approach vectors. Through the periscopes, Jake watched confusion ripple through the assault team. The man near the foundation stumbled as the platform shifted beneath his feet. The overwatch position to the north suddenly became exposed as the cabin's orientation changed. Most critically, their communication became scattered as the rotating structure broke their sight lines with each other. Jake smiled grimly as he continued cranking the mechanism. His grandfather had built more than a storm shelter. He'd created a fortress that could literally turn the tables on any threat. The question was no longer whether Jake could survive until the storm passed. The question was whether his hunters were prepared for prey that could reshape the battlefield itself. The first shot shattered the silence like breaking glass, echoing off the canyon walls before being swallowed by the howling wind. Jake's blood turned to ice as he pressed himself against the cabin's outer wall, the rough-hewn logs digging into his back through his jacket. They'd found him. Another crack split the air, this time closer. Through the storm's fury, he caught glimpses of muzzle flashes, 3 distinct positions spread across the clearing, professional spacing. These weren't desperate men firing wildly. They were hunters who knew their craft. Jake's mind raced as he calculated distances and angles. The main door faced east, directly into their field of fire. The windows on the north and south walls offered no better escape routes, but Grandpa Joe's design hadn't been built just for weather. It had been built by a man who understood that sometimes the greatest storms came with guns. Crawling along the foundation, Jake felt for the concealed latch his grandfather had shown him years ago. His fingers, numb despite his gloves, fumbled over the ice-covered logs until they found the hidden depression. The panel swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the entire cabin. The space was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, designed as an emergency escape route that most people would never think to look for. Jake squeezed through the opening, pulling it shut behind him just as boots crunched through the snow above his head. "Check the perimeter!" Morrison's voice cut through the storm. "He's got to be here somewhere. That smoke didn't come from nowhere." Jake, army crawled through the darkness, following the foundation's edge by feel. The crawl space was filled with the sound of his own breathing and the muffled voices above. Every few feet, he paused to listen, mapping their positions by their footsteps and shouts. Doors barricaded from the inside, came another voice. "Want me to blow it? No explosives in this wind," Morrison replied. "You'll bring half the mountain down on us. Find another way in." Jake reached the northwest corner of the foundation, where another hidden panel led to the root cellar. He'd cached emergency supplies here 3 seasons ago, among them his grandfather's old Winchester and a box of ammunition. The rifle was insurance Joe had insisted on, not for hunting, but for the 2-legged predators that sometimes wandered too far into the wilderness. The cellar was pitch black and cramped, carved directly into the mountainside and reinforced with stone. Jake felt along the shelves until his fingers closed around the rifle's familiar stock. The weapon was exactly where he'd left it, wrapped in oilcloth and ready for use. He loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, the metallic clicks unnaturally loud in the confined space. Above, something heavy crashed against the cabin door. They were trying to break in, probably using a makeshift battering ram. The sound echoed through the foundation, followed by Morrison's cursing as the reinforced door held firm. "This place is built like a damn fortress," someone complained. "Then we go through the walls," Morrison snarled. "Start chopping, and keep your eyes open. He might try to rabbit." Jake heard the bite of an axe into wood. They were committed now, which meant they'd be focused on the task and less aware of their surroundings. It was the opportunity he needed. He slipped out of the root cellar through an entrance concealed by a boulder, emerging into the storm 20 yards behind their positions. The wind and snow provided perfect cover as he worked his way uphill, using the terrain and the blizzard's fury to mask his movement. From his elevated position, he could see all 3 men clearly. Morrison stood near the cabin's front corner, directing operations while the other 2 took turns with the axe. They'd made progress, wood chips scattered across the snow, and Jake could see the first hole appearing in the wall. The smart play was to slip away into the storm, let them discover the empty cabin, and hope they'd assume he'd already fled. But Jake knew Morrison better than that now. The man wouldn't give up easily, and in this blizzard, running meant certain death. The storm was getting worse, not better, and he'd already pushed his luck staying alive this long. No, this ended here, one way or another. Jake settled into a firing position behind a fallen tree, the Winchester's barrel resting steady on the trunk. The wind gusted hard from the west, which he factored into his aim. At this range, maybe 60 yards, it would push the bullet left. He drew a bead on Morrison first, cut off the head and the body would follow. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, one of the other men stepped directly into his line of fire, obscuring the target. The moment passed. Morrison moved again, this time taking cover behind the cabin's corner. Jake settled in to wait. The storm was his ally now, and patience had always been his greatest weapon. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus could feel the weight of his rifle against his shoulder, finger poised over the trigger, while Kane stood motionless in the doorway. Snow continued to whirl behind the mercenary, nature's fury providing an almost surreal backdrop to their standoff. "You killed my grandfather," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. Kane's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Old man put up more of a fight than expected. Should have just told us where you were." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His grandfather had protected him even in death, had endured whatever these men had done to him without breaking. The knowledge fueled something dark and primal within him. "He never broke, did he?" Marcus asked, taking a half-step forward. "That's why you're here, because even facing death, he wouldn't give me up." Kane's eyes flickered with something that might have been respect. "Tough old bastard. Reminded me of myself at that age." He shifted slightly, and Marcus caught the subtle movement of his hand toward the pistol at his hip. "But we found you anyway, tracked you through that storm like the animal you are. 3 of you came up this mountain," Marcus said, not lowering his rifle. "Where are the others?" "Dead." Kane's admission carried no emotion. "Mountain claimed Rodriguez yesterday. Your little trap at the bridge took care of Volkov. Messy way to go." Marcus felt a grim satisfaction at the confirmation. The odds were better now, but Kane radiated the dangerous competence of a man who'd survived when others hadn't. This wasn't over. "So, what's the play here?" Marcus asked. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a blizzard. Your employer's already written you off." Kane laughed, a harsh sound that echoed strangely in the confined space. "Kid, you think this is about the money anymore? This stopped being a job the moment your grandfather carved up my face with that rusty knife of his." He pulled his pistol with fluid motion, but Marcus was already moving. The rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Kane spun sideways, blood spraying across the doorframe, but he didn't go down. The mercenary was tougher than Marcus had hoped. Kane returned fire, his shot splintering wood inches from Marcus's head as the younger man dove behind the heavy kitchen table. The logs his grandfather had chosen for the cabin walls absorbed the bullets, the sound like someone pounding nails with a sledgehammer. "Can't hide forever, boy," Kane called out, his voice strained but still strong. "This cabin's smaller than a coffin, and I've got all night." Marcus rolled to his left, coming up near the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, making it harder to track movement. He could hear Kane moving, could sense the man's presence like a predator marking territory. A board creaked near the kitchen. Marcus spun and fired, the muzzle flash illuminating empty air. Kane had already moved, flowing through the darkness with professional skill despite his wound. The next shot came from behind the wood stove, forcing Marcus to duck low. He was burning through ammunition too quickly, each shot precious in this deadly game of cat and mouse. Kane likely carried more ammunition, more experience, and the patience of a career killer. Marcus needed to change the dynamic. He grabbed one of the oil lamps from beside the fireplace and hurled it toward the back of the cabin. Glass shattered and flames spread across the floor, creating a barrier of light and heat. In the sudden illumination, he spotted Kane pressed against the wall near the kitchen, blood staining his left shoulder. Both men fired simultaneously. Marcus felt the burn of a bullet creasing his ribs as Kane grunted and stumbled backward. The mercenary's shot had been hurried, thrown off by the sudden light and his own wound. The flames were spreading now, feeding on the dry wood shavings and kindling stored near the stove. Smoke began to fill the air, creating another layer of confusion in their deadly dance. Kane emerged from behind the stove, his face a mask of blood and determination. "You want to burn us both alive, kid? Fine by me, been in worse places." Marcus could see the truth in the man's eyes. Kane had nothing left to lose, no exit strategy beyond taking Marcus with him. The professional had become something more dangerous, a wounded animal with nothing but vengeance driving him forward. The cabin groaned around them, the spreading fire already beginning to weaken the structure. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, as if nature itself demanded a resolution to this conflict. Marcus steadied his rifle, knowing the next few seconds would determine everything. His grandfather's cabin, his sanctuary, was burning around them. Soon they'd both face the storm outside, if either of them survived the next exchange of gunfire. The foundation beneath Jake's feet groaned like a living thing as the storm's fury reached its crescendo. Snow had buried the cabin's windows completely, turning his refuge into a tomb of timber and stone. He pressed his ear to the floor, listening to his grandfather's unconventional foundation work its magic, the interlocked stone and timber system flexing with the mountain's movement rather than fighting it. A sharp crack echoed through the darkness above the wind's howl. Not wood, not stone, glass. Jake's blood turned to ice. The men had found him. He grabbed his rifle and crept toward the back of the cabin, where he'd reinforced a small escape route his grandfather had built into the foundation. The old man had called it a prairie dog hole, a survival exit that dropped directly into the crawl space beneath the flexing foundation stones. Another crack, followed by muffled voices. They were trying to break through the ice-sealed door. Jake dropped through the hidden panel in the floor, landing softly in the space between the foundation stones. His grandfather's design created a network of channels that allowed airflow and prevented ice dams, but tonight they would serve as his lifeline. The stones above him shifted and settled with each gust of wind, but held firm. He belly-crawled through the narrow passages, following the route he'd memorized during countless childhood explorations. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it led to an opening 20 yards from the cabin, concealed by a carefully placed boulder. Behind him, wood splintered. They were inside. Jake emerged from the foundation tunnel into the full fury of the blizzard. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow so hard it felt like sand against his exposed skin. Visibility was zero. He could barely make out the dark bulk of his cabin through the swirling white chaos. But he knew this mountain. Every tree, every rock, every depression that could provide shelter. The men hunting him didn't. He circled wide, using the storm as cover. His grandfather had taught him that in extreme weather, the mountain itself became your weapon. You didn't fight the storm, you made it fight for you. The cabin's windows glowed faintly from within. They'd found his lantern, maybe started a fire. 3 distinct shadows moved past the windows, all armed, from the silhouettes. They'd be searching his supplies, trying to understand how he'd survived this long. Jake reached the equipment cache he'd buried near the tree line. His numb fingers dug through the snow until he found the waterproof container. Inside, emergency flares, a small radio, and his grandfather's old hunting knife, the one with the carved antler handle that had been through 2 wars. The radio crackled to life on the emergency frequency, but static overwhelmed any signal. He was still on his own. Movement near the cabin's rear wall caught his attention. One of them had found his escape route. A figure emerged from the foundation tunnel following his tracks. The man stood and raised what looked like a military-style rifle, scanning the immediate area. Jake belly-crawled closer, using the storm's noise to mask his approach. 20 yards, 15, 10. The man turned, just as Jake lunged. They went down hard in the deep snow, grappling for control of the rifle. Jake's mountain conditioning gave him the edge. Months of high-altitude living had strengthened his lungs and muscles while these men struggled with the thin air. He drove his grandfather's knife between the man's ribs, quick and clean. The fight went out of him instantly. Voices called from the cabin. They'd noticed their partner's absence. Jake took the dead man's rifle and tactical vest, then dragged the body behind a fallen tree. The storm would cover the rest. He had to move fast before they organized a real search. The cabin's front door hung open, spilling warm light across the snow-covered porch. 2 men stood silhouetted in the doorway, clearly arguing about their next move. One wanted to wait out the storm. The other insisted on tracking Jake immediately. Jake settled into a shooting position behind a natural snow barrier, using the same spot where he'd watched elk graze just days ago. The rifle was military-grade, with a scope he didn't need at this range. 50 yards through driving snow, his grandfather had taught him to make harder shots with iron sights. He lined up on the man closest to the door's edge, breathed out slowly, the way the old man had shown him. Let his heartbeat settle. The storm provided perfect cover for the sound of the shot. The first man dropped instantly. The second dove back into the cabin, shouting warnings. Jake was already moving, using the foundation's exterior stones as cover while he approached from a new angle. The remaining man would be panicked now, making mistakes. The warm cabin would have compromised his night vision, and the storm disoriented his hearing. Time to finish this. The wind had died to an eerie whisper, but Jake knew better than to trust the temporary calm. Through the reinforced window, he watched Marcus emerge from the tree line like a predator scenting wounded prey. The man moved with calculated precision, his rifle trained on the cabin's entrance, steam rising from his breath in the frigid air. Jake's ribs screamed as he shifted position, pressing himself against the log wall beside the door. The cabin had held through the worst of the storm, Grandpa Tom's foundation technique proving its worth as tons of snow and ice had battered the structure. But now he faced a different kind of test, one that wouldn't be won by engineering alone. "I know you're in there, Beck," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Danny's dead, and I'm betting you're not far behind. Make this easy on both of us." Jake closed his eyes, forcing himself to think past the pain. The Glock felt heavy in his grip. 13 rounds left in the magazine. He'd counted them twice. Marcus was maybe 40 yards out, using a massive pine for cover, professional distance for a man with a rifle facing someone with a handgun. The cabin's interior told the story of his desperate night. Overturned furniture, scattered supplies, dark stains where Danny had fallen. The propane lantern cast dancing shadows that might work to his advantage if Marcus decided to come inside. Big if. "Your grandfather built this place well," Marcus continued, circling slowly to his left. "But I've got all day, and you're bleeding on borrowed time." The taunt hit closer to home than Jake wanted to admit. The makeshift bandage around his torso was soaked through, and every breath sent fresh fire through his damaged ribs. He needed to end this soon, before blood loss made the decision for him. A memory surfaced, Grandpa Tom demonstrating the cabin's hidden features during that last summer visit. Not just the foundation technique, but other tricks built into the structure. Emergency exits weren't just doors and windows to a man who'd survived 3 wars. Jake glanced toward the back corner where the wood stove sat. Behind it, concealed by careful craftsmanship, was a panel that opened to a crawl space beneath the raised floor. Tom had called it his rabbit hole, a last resort escape route that emerged behind the woodshed 30 feet from the cabin's rear wall. The problem was getting to it without Marcus seeing the movement through the windows. The man was smart, patient, probably trained. He'd be watching for exactly this kind of desperate play. Jake waited, controlling his breathing despite the pain. Marcus was still talking, trying to flush him out with a mixture of threats and false promises. Professional interrogator tactics, the kind of skills that suggested military or intelligence background. When Marcus moved again, shifting to get a better angle on the cabin's front, Jake made his move. He crawled toward the stove, staying low, using the overturned table for cover. His ribs protested every inch of progress, but he bit down on the pain and kept moving. The panel opened silently, Tom's craftsmanship at its finest. The crawl space beyond was cramped and dark, barely 3 feet high. Jake squeezed through, pulling the panel closed behind him. The space smelled of earth and old wood, insulation brushing against his back as he army crawled through the narrow passage. Above him, he could hear Marcus moving closer to the cabin, boots crunching in the snow. The man was talking louder now, probably preparing to make his entry. Jake had maybe 2 minutes before Marcus discovered the cabin was empty. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, each forward movement a study in controlled agony. His vision blurred from blood loss and pain, but he forced himself onward. The exit panel was somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the woodshed's raised floor. When his reaching hand finally found the second panel, Jake paused to listen. No sounds from above, Marcus was still focused on the cabin. Jake pushed the panel open and emerged into the shadowy space beneath the shed. Pale light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards above. He rose slowly, fighting dizziness, and peered through a crack in the shed's wall. Marcus had reached the cabin's entrance, his back turned as he prepared to breach the door. 40 feet of open ground separated them, an impossible distance for an accurate pistol shot, especially in his condition. But Jake had one advantage Marcus couldn't know about. Tom had prepared for more than just storms and cold. Hidden beneath the woodshed's main support beam was a Remington 700, wrapped in oiled canvas, loaded and ready. His grandfather's insurance policy. Jake's hands shook as he unwrapped the rifle, muscle memory from countless hunting trips guiding his movements. The scope was old but clear, the action smooth despite years of storage. He chambered around and settled the crosshairs on Marcus's center mass. The man kicked in the cabin door just as Jake's finger found the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the storm like thunder, and Jake felt the bullet tear through the air inches from his head. He dove behind the massive corner post of the cabin, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. "And these posts will hold when everything else fails." "Come out, Mac Kenna," Reeves shouted over the howling wind. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Jake pressed his back against the timber, feeling the solid strength of the foundation beneath his feet. The storm raged with unprecedented fury, but the cabin held firm. Snow drove horizontally across the clearing, creating a white veil that made visibility nearly impossible. He could use that. Through the blizzard, he caught glimpses of movement. 3 figures, maybe 4, spread out in a rough semicircle around the cabin. They'd followed his trail despite the storm, probably using GPS until they got close enough to see his lights. Professional, determined, and armed. Another shot splintered wood near his head. Jake rolled along the cabin wall, staying low, until he reached the corner where he'd stacked the extra firewood. His rifle lay inside, useless to him now, but his grandfather had taught him that survival wasn't just about weapons, it was about using everything at your disposal. The wind shifted, and Jake heard voices carried on the gusts. They were moving closer, trying to flank him. He glanced up at the cabin's roofline, where snow had built up into massive drifts. An idea formed, dangerous but possible. "Nowhere to run now," another voice called out, closer than before. Jake grabbed the small folding shovel from his pack and began working frantically at the base of the snowdrift that had accumulated against the cabin's north wall. The foundation posts extended 3 feet above ground level, creating a natural snow trap. If he could destabilize the right section. A figure emerged from the white curtain of snow, rifle raised. Jake threw himself sideways as the man fired, the bullet striking the cabin wall with a sharp crack. He came up running, zigzagging through the storm toward the tree line. There! He's moving! More shots followed, but the blizzard made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Jake reached the edge of the clearing and spun around, putting his back to a massive pine. From here, he could see the cabin more clearly, and the men advancing on it. They moved like professionals, covering each other, communicating with hand signals even in the storm, military or ex-military, just as he'd suspected. But they were thinking like soldiers in an urban environment, not survivalists in a mountain blizzard. Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a piercing whistle, a signal his grandfather had taught him for calling across mountain valleys. The sound cut through the wind, echoing off the surrounding peaks. The response came immediately, a deep rumble from the mountainside above. The storm had loaded the slopes with unstable snow, and the acoustic trigger was enough to start a small avalanche. Nothing that would reach the cabin, Jake wasn't that reckless, but enough to spook the men and mask his movement. As snow crashed through the trees higher up the mountain, Jake circled back toward the cabin, using the distraction. He could see Reeves now, shouting orders to his men, trying to regroup in the chaos of wind and driving snow. The blizzard was reaching its peak intensity. Even through his winter gear, Jake could feel the cold trying to penetrate to his core. But this was his element, his grandfather's training ground. Every winter storm he'd weathered in this cabin had prepared him for this moment. He reached the back side of the cabin, where the kitchen window looked out over the clearing. Moving carefully, he worked his way along the foundation until he reached the propane tank that fed the cabin's heating system. His grandfather had always kept emergency supplies here, including... Jake's fingers found what he was looking for, a small emergency flare gun, wrapped in waterproof plastic and secured to the tank mounting. He pulled it free and checked the chamber. One shot. Through the storm, he could see the men regrouping near the front of the cabin. They'd realized he wasn't inside and were preparing to move into the trees after him, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd gotten too close together, seeking mutual support against the storm. Jake raised the flare gun, aimed not at the men but at the massive snowdrift he'd been working on earlier, and fired. The red flare struck the unstable snow mass and ignited, the sudden heat and light causing a localized collapse. Tons of snow cascaded down from the cabin's roof and the accumulated drift, creating a small but effective avalanche that swept across the clearing. The men scattered, shouting in alarm as the white wall engulfed their position. Jake didn't wait to see the result. He was already moving, using the chaos to get back to the cabin's entrance. The storm was his ally now, concealing his approach as the men struggled to reorient themselves in the knee-deep powder. The foundation held, the cabin stood firm, and somewhere in the swirling white darkness, 4 dangerous men were learning the difference between hunting a man in the city and facing a survivor on his own mountain. The storm had become a living thing, its voice dropping to whispers as dawn broke grey and muted through the dissipating clouds. Marcus pressed his back against the cabin wall, listening to the subtle shift in wind patterns that meant the worst had finally passed. 3 days. 3 days of hell that had stripped away everything except the raw will to survive. The silence from the root cellar stretched into its second hour. He'd heard Kozlov's labored breathing fade sometime before midnight, the man's body finally succumbing to blood loss and the bitter cold that had seeped through every crack in the storm shelter. The other mercenary had gone quiet even earlier, his protests about the cold becoming increasingly incoherent before stopping altogether. Marcus flexed his fingers around the rifle grip, working feeling back into joints that had locked up during the endless vigil. His grandfather's cabin had held. The foundation technique that everyone had mocked, those massive stones sunk deep into the mountainside, the unconventional anchoring system that seemed like overkill, had kept the structure intact when lesser buildings would have been torn apart. But surviving the storm was only half the battle. He moved carefully to the window, brushing away ice crystals that had formed on the inside of the glass. The world outside looked alien, sculpted by wind into impossible shapes. Drifts 20 feet high leaned against trees that had been stripped bare, their branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The landscape had been completely rewritten. The silence bothered him more than the storm's fury had. In that howling chaos, he'd known where the threats were. Now, in this cathedral quiet, every shadow could hide danger. His grandfather had always said the mountain was most dangerous when it seemed peaceful. Marcus pulled on his heaviest gear, checking the rifle one more time before stepping into the airlock entry his grandfather had built. Even this detail, which had seemed like paranoia, made sense now. The double-door system kept the heat in and allowed him to assess conditions before fully committing to going outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, despite his preparations. The thermometer read 38 below zero, not counting wind chill. But the wind had finally dropped to almost nothing, leaving the air crystalline and sharp enough to cut. He made his way carefully toward the root cellar, each step requiring deliberate effort in snow that reached his waist. The door lay partially buried, barely visible except for the corner of rusted metal that caught the weak sunlight. Marcus cleared the snow methodically, his breathing creating small clouds that dissipated instantly in the dry air. When he finally pulled the door open, the smell hit him immediately, the metallic scent of blood mixed with the deeper odor of men who had died afraid. Both bodies lay exactly where he'd expected. Kozlov near the entrance, his face grey and peaceful in death. The younger mercenary further back, curled in on himself like a child. The root cellar that had saved Marcus during his first winter on the mountain had become their tomb. He searched their bodies quickly, finding identification, cash, and most importantly, a satellite phone that still held a partial charge. The device represented his first real contact with the outside world since the storm began. But it also raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. Who had sent these men? The official story about his father's research had never satisfied Marcus, and now armed mercenaries had tracked him to one of the most remote locations in Colorado. Someone wanted whatever secrets his father had died protecting. Marcus pocketed the phone and began the grim task of dealing with the bodies. The ground was far too frozen for burial, but leaving them in the root cellar wasn't an option. He dragged them outside, struggling with dead weight in the deep snow, and arranged them in a natural depression about 50 yards from the cabin. The mountain would keep them frozen until spring, when the authorities could recover them properly. By the time he finished, the sun had climbed higher, its light brilliant against the snow but carrying no warmth. Marcus made his way back to the cabin, each step requiring conscious effort as exhaustion finally caught up with him. Inside, the warmth felt like an embrace. He fed the fire, made coffee with the last of his grounds, and sat in his grandfather's chair to consider his options. The storm was breaking, but it would be days before any rescue could reach him. The satellite phone gave him the ability to call for help, but doing so would bring questions he couldn't answer without putting other people at risk. His grandfather's journal lay open on the table where he'd left it, the familiar handwriting offering silent counsel. The old man had faced his own share of dangerous men and impossible choices. He'd survived by being smarter, more patient, and more prepared than his enemies. Marcus picked up the satellite phone, studying its display. Soon he would have to decide whether to call for rescue or disappear into the wilderness his grandfather had taught him to navigate. Either choice would change everything, but at least now he had the luxury of making that choice alive. The mountain had tested him, and he had endured.